Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Kansas. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1887, a wandering surveyor named Elias Whitcomb arrived in a dusty, remote settlement in western Kansas. The sky was low and overcast, with heavy clouds drifting across the high plains wind. The settlement had only a scattering of wooden shacks and a single saloon known as the Silver Spur. Locals whispered that the bar had changed hands several times and that trouble always followed. Whitcomb's official purpose was to mark property boundaries for a new railroad spur, a branch from the old Kansas Pacific lines that once cut across the region. The Kansas Pacific had ceased independent operation years earlier, but its old right-of-way still drew interest from developers and speculators. Wikipedia, Whitcomb's journal, begins with a sober note. The spur lies emptily, but the saloon stands silent and low, awaiting claims and calamities alike. He lodged at the Silver Spur for several nights. The saloon owner, a lean man calling himself J.T. Carr, claimed to be just passing through. Carr was reluctant to name the previous proprietor. The bar room was dim. Wooden plank walls, a tarnished, mirrored back, a ledger behind the counter with cryptic entries. Patrons were sparse. A weary ranch hand, a stranger who would not speak, and a man who sat alone, nursing whiskey, eyes far off. Whitcomb wrote that even in daylight, a feeling of unease clung to the building. Floorboards seemed slightly irregular, and the smell of damp earth lingered beneath. He made mention in his notes. I heard late at night a hollow tapping, as though from underground. By local recollect. Ion, before 1887, this land had belonged to a widower named Silas Granger. He died in 1884, leaving no known children, and his widow vanished soon after. Neighbors recalled that Granger was secretive, kept large storerooms underground, and forbade visitors beneath his floor. One elderly neighbor, Martha Ackers, recalled hearing muffled arguments and drunken voices late into the night. I once heard a groan beneath the floor, she swore in a later affidavit, though she insisted she could not distinguish words. The Silver Spur itself had a tenuous reputation in surrounding settlements such as Dodge City, known for saloons, gambling, and lawmen. Wikipedia, tales of shootouts and missing men were common, but no one linked those rumors directly to the saloon along the remote spur until Whitcomb's arrival. Whitcomb spent nights mapping the floor joists and sketching thin lines of dirt around the bar. He noted that some floorboards had been replaced recently, the nails newer, the wood less worn. His next entry: I must pry open beneath them. Something hides. I fear in every shadow. When Elias Whitcomb decided to lift the floorboards of the Silver Spur, it was not out of curiosity but necessity. He wrote that the saloon's floor swelled unevenly after rain, though no rainwater could have reached that deep inside the structure. With the landlord's reluctant consent, or perhaps while the man slept, Whitcomb pried open a section near the bar's rear wall. Beneath, he found not the expected foundation stones or compact soil, but a dark void and a faint, stale draft rising upward. It smelled of iron and salt, he wrote in his notebook, and something else, what I cannot name. Word spread quickly among the handful of residents nearby. By the following evening, 3 men joined Whitcomb, a blacksmith named Orton Hale, a farmhand called Levi Burns, and Reverend Joel Cutter, the circuit preacher for the county. They carried lanterns, ropes, and an air of unease. Cutter later told a journalist from the Emporia Weekly Gazette that he felt the Lord had hidden something in that floor for good reason. The hole was widened until a circular stone lip emerged, about 5 feet in diameter. It was unmistakably a well, old, lined with limestone, and far deeper than anyone expected. Yet it had been sealed from above with timber, nails, and tar. There was no bucket, no pulley, no sign that it had been used for water. Hale, the blacksmith, recalled lowering a lantern by rope. It swung gently and struck what sounded like bone. The light swayed across what appeared to be a small chamber carved into the soil wall, Cutter's account said it best. The flame danced upon pale fragments, and though no word was spoken, each man knew what he saw. When they returned the next morning, the sheriff from neighboring Ford County had arrived, a man named Everett Lang, a former deputy from Dodge City, who had worked under lawman Bat Masterson in his youth. Lang ordered the saloon CL. OZ and posted a notice forbidding entry until further inquiry. Lang's report, later preserved in the county archive, stated that at least 3 human remains were retrieved from the well. 2 adult males and 1 smaller, possibly juvenile skeleton. Each showed blunt trauma to the skull, and in one case, a fractured wrist as though bound. There were traces of fabric, possibly linen, alongside rusted metal fasteners and an unmarked pocket watch. For a brief moment, Dodge City's notoriety for lawlessness seemed to stretch eastward once more. The Topeka Daily Capital ran a headline in early June of 1887. Bodies found beneath Western Bar. Authorities seek origins. Sheriff Lang suspected that the killings had occurred years earlier, possibly before Silas Granger's death. Yet when Lang attempted to locate property deeds predating 1883, he found that several had been lost in a courthouse fire, a not uncommon fate for Kansas records of the period. What remained suggested that Granger had purchased the building site from a dissolved partnership called Carter Baines Mercantile, a trading outfit that had vanished by 1879 with no formal closure notice. The more Lang searched, the less he found. A chain of missing documents, unsigned ledgers, and one recurring name appeared throughout: S. Granger, always noted beside cryptic entries labeled only as deliveries received. By midsummer, the investigation reached an impasse. The Silver Spur was boarded up, its new owner gone without a trace. But locals began reporting that, on quiet nights, they could still hear the faint metallic creak of a pulley wheel beneath the floor. Sheriff Everett Lang continued to hold jurisdiction over the case through that stifling Kansas summer. The air was thick with dust, and the prairie winds carried a smell of clay and stagnant water across the small settlement. Lang's field notes, later transcribed by a county clerk, show a man torn between reason and something more elusive. "I have handled murders," he wrote, "but never bones that spoke in silence." The remains from the well were transported to Dodge City for examination by Dr. Miriam Cole, one of the few women physicians in the region at that time. Her report, dated July 10, 1887, described the skeletal damage as consistent with multiple blunt instruments, hammers, or pistol butts. She noted a peculiarity. Each skull had a similar notch near the left temple, suggesting deliberate, repeated blows. "Not rage," she wrote, "ritual precision." The Silver Spur's landlord, J.T. Carr, had disappeared the night of the sheriff's arrival. His few belongings were found in a travel case upstairs: a worn revolver, a single photograph of an unknown woman, and a ledger containing names without last initials: Miles, Edgar, Ruth, Warren, James. Most entries ended abruptly, their ink faded by damp. A drifter named Jacob North later testified he had shared whiskey with Carr weeks earlier. North claimed Carr boasted that the saloon's floor sat over old debts paid in kind. Lang's deputies dismissed the statement as drunken nonsense, but when North was found dead 2 months later, his throat cut beside a disused cattle trail, rumors hardened into fear. From that point, the investigation drew on fragments, unsigned telegrams, half-burned letters, and the whispers of those who had frequented the spur. The building, abandoned and sealed, became a destination for the curious. Travelers said the air inside was colder, heavier. A trader passing through claimed that the mere, or behind the bar, sometimes showed a second room dimly lit when lanterns were extinguished. Lang requested assistance from the railroad office, suspecting the well might have been part of an earlier depot structure. The records officer at the Kansas Pacific branch confirmed that in 1874, before the Silver Spur was built, there had been a short-lived freight stop nearby, Granger's Crossing. It was a name that tied directly back to Silas Granger. The officer also mentioned that missing cargo was once reported there. Crates listed as medical supplies. No follow-up was ever found. When Lang revisited the site in late August, He noted that the board sealing the saloon's entrance had been pried open. Inside, the dust bore fresh footprints, but the cellar, once thought to be the only underground feature, now revealed a second passageway, narrow, stone-lined, and sloping toward the well's base. At the far end of that passage, his lantern caught something glinting beneath the dirt, brass buckles, fragments of glass, and a single human molar embedded in the wall. He ordered the tunnel resealed immediately. By autumn, the story faded from the newspapers, overtaken by the bloody labor strikes and railroad expansions that swept the Midwest. But among the remaining settlers, the phrase, "the well under the spur," became shorthand for something better left undisturbed. By the winter of 1887, the Silver Spur stood like a scar on the prairie, its windows boarded, its sign half torn by wind. Sheriff Everett Lang had left the county by then, his resignation written in terse, unsteady handwriting. "The well is closed, the earth reclaimed, let it rest." No successor ever reopened the file. But in January of 1888, Reverend Joel Cutter, who had first accompanied Elias Whitcomb to the site, began keeping what he called a record of spiritual disturbances. His small leather-bound journal, later discovered in a church trunk, spoke in language both precise and frightened. "Each Sunday," he wrote, "I hear talk among my parishioners of dreams, always the same, a sound of water drawn by unseen hands and the scent of iron." Cutter's entries reveal that several of his congregation had once worked for the short-lived freight post known as Granger's Crossing. They described a man named Silas Granger as a respectable merchant during the early 1870s, dealing in dry goods, feed, and later in medical freight, transported eastward toward Topeka. None could say exactly why his business collapsed, only that his wife's health declined, and he took to drink and darkness. One aging clerk, Samuel Dent, remembered visiting Granger's property in 1878. He told Cutter that Granger had built a cooling pit under the trading post to store perishables, but later forbade anyone from going near it. Dent claimed the floorboards were already being reinforced then, years before the saloon was erected. When Cutter cross-checked Dent's statement against county ledgers, he found that the Granger account had been abruptly erased. On the following page, written in the same clerk's hand, appeared the single line, "All debts settled in kind." Meanwhile, Elias Whitcomb, the man who had first exposed the well, had disappeared on his return journey east. His horse was found, riderless near the Smoky Hill River, saddle intact, but his maps and notes gone. One folded scrap later turned up in the belongings of a surveyor's assistant, a rough sketch of the saloon's floor, the well marked by a single X, and beside it the word, "Delivered." By March of 1888, Reverend Cutter's final journal entry read, "The wind hums across the empty railbed. The well beneath that cursed floor yet breathes. When I pass, I feel it in my chest, as though the earth below were still remembering." In later years, historians studying the Kansas frontier, including references within Dodge City's own town archives, occasionally mentioned the Whitcomb case, often relegated to footnotes. The period was one of transient populations and inconsistent law enforcement, and most dismissed it as frontier folklore exaggerated by time. Yet a few county clerks insisted the saloon once stood on a freight route mapped in official railway records, a route never completed, never explained. And so the Silver Spur remained shuttered, its precise location fading from local maps, the prairie grass reclaiming what the wind could not carry away. The spring of 1889 brought new settlers to the region, farmers, traders, and prospectors who had heard of fertile land near the old Kansas Pacific route. Most avoided the plot where the Silver Spur once stood, though few knew exactly why. A blackened outline of the saloon's foundation still marked the soil, the boards long scavenged for other buildings. Children who wandered close swore the ground sounded hollow, as if echoing the weight of their steps. In May of that year, the county's newly appointed constable, Thomas Baird, received a letter from a man identifying himself as L.C. Warren. The writer claimed to be an associate of the late Silas Granger, and offered information regarding items concealed under a former commercial property along the spur line. The letter's tone was meticulous, legalistic, and oddly urgent. Retrieve them before the summer rains. They were never meant to be buried. Baird took the matter seriously enough to ride out to the site, accompanied by a deputy and a hired digger. What they found, recorded in the constable's logbook, was not treasure, but decay. A partially collapsed shaft near the saloon's remains. Within it lay fragments of a wooden crate, still bound by corroded wire. Inside were dozens of small glass vials, most shattered, and a faint residue that caused the men to cough violently. The labels had been eaten away, but one survived just enough to read, Compound Ether, St. Louis. The vials were sent to Topeka for examination. The chemist's notes, preserved in the Kansas State Historical Society archive, mentioned traces of chloroform and opium derivatives, substances used in rudimentary medical practice, but also in illicit trade along the railways. The discovery reignited whispers that Granger's Crossing had been part of a contraband network moving narcotics under the guise of medicine, an operation abruptly ended by violence. A newspaper interest briefly resurfaced. The Dodge City Globe printed a column suggesting that the bones beneath the saloon may have belonged to couriers who knew too much. But official investigation was short-lived. The vials disappeared en route from Topeka to Lawrence, their crate misfiled under unclaimed evidence. By late summer, the prairie reclaimed the place again. Wild sage grew thick around the pit, and travelers described a strange stillness there, no insects, no birdsong. One farmer, Andrew Holcomb, claimed that on certain nights the wind through the open shaft made a low humming sound, like a voice trying to rise through water. That same season, Reverend Cutter died quietly in his parsonage. His church papers mentioned that he had recently visited Dodge City to speak with one of the old railroad men about the Granger affair. No transcript of that meeting exists. In subsequent years, official maps omitted the site altogether. Only marginal notes in dusty ledgers refer to Section 12, restricted. It was a bureaucratic way of burying what could not be explained. Yet among ranch hands and drifters passing through, the story persisted, that beneath an old saloon floor, sealed and forgotten, a well still whispered the names of those who had fallen in. By 1891, the story of the Silver Spur had retreated into the kind of legend men tell when the lamps burn low and the prairie wind rattles the windows. Yet even legends leave paper trails. That year, a newly appointed clerk in Ford County, Miss Clara Densmore, was tasked with cataloging old property assessments for the railroad survey. Among the brittle sheets and water-stained ledgers, she found an unregistered claim form signed simply E. Whitcomb, June 1887. The document referenced excavation of subterranean structure 2 miles east of Granger's Crossing. It was stamped, filed, not processed. On the back, written faintly in pencil, were 4 words, "The floor is thin." Densmore sent the file to her superior, who ordered it sealed as irrelevant, but her private journal, later discovered in her estate, contained several observations suggesting she had visited the area herself. "There is nothing left of the spur," she wrote, "but the air holds an odor I cannot name. The ground sags in places, like breath caught beneath the soil." Around the same time, Dodge City's local paper printed an obituary for Sheriff Everett Lang. He had died in Colorado, far from Kansas, with no family to claim his effects. Among his possessions was a small parcel wrapped in oiled cloth labeled Silver Spur, 1887. Inside, a rusted pocket watch, a folded map marked with a single red X, and a clipping from the Topeka Daily Capital detailing the discovery of the bodies. Someone had underlined one sentence in pencil, "Further investigation pending." By 1892, a drought settled across western Kansas. Wells ran dry, livestock perished, and settlers left in search of wetter soil. Yet one rancher, Harold Dunn, kept his homestead within sight of the old spur's remains. He told neighbors that he occasionally saw a dim light flicker where the saloon once stood. "Not lantern light," he said. "Blue, low, as if coming from under the earth." Dunn's claim reached the county seat, and a surveyor was sent to check for methane pockets, common in abandoned wells. The report concluded no gas emissions were present. Still, Dunn's livestock began dying mysteriously, their water troughs stained by a thin, oily sheen. He abandoned the property the following spring. In 1894, one final entry appears in the county record under the heading Health Sanitation. It notes that the former spur property was excavated and burned by order of municipal authority. No signature followed, no details of what was recovered, and the pages after were torn out. That year, Reverend Cutter's successor delivered a sermon referencing the sins buried deep within our soil. Parishioners later recalled his words, "The Lord alone knows what is beneath us, and it is not for us to raise." As the century turned, the rail lines shifted southward, bypassing the spur entirely. The story fell quiet, swallowed by prairie dust and time. Yet those who rode through on moonless nights swore they saw faint depressions in the land, as though something below still pressed upward, waiting. By 1896, Kansas was changing fast. Railroads rerouted, new towns sprouting and dying within a year. The empty stretch once called Granger's Crossing faded from maps altogether, replaced by survey numbers and ownership codes. Yet one name kept returning in private correspondence between clerks and local officials: the Whitcomb File. The name appeared again when an Eastern journalist, Thomas Ellery from the St. Louis Dispatch, arrived to investigate old frontier crimes for a series he called The Forgotten Dead. Ellery's notes, preserved in fragments, mentioned that he first heard of the case while interviewing former railroad employees about smuggling operations near Dodge City. One of them, a retired station master, recalled a freight manifest lost in 1874 that listed unclaimed bodies for transport, destination Topeka Medical College. Ellery traced the connection to the Silver Spur and to Silas Granger's short-lived business. In his notebook, he wrote, "If freight and medicine shared the same wagons, there was more to the man than a failing merchant." He interviewed surviving townsfolk, most elderly now, and pieced together their recollections. Some said Granger was charitable, handing out food during lean winters. Others whispered that he paid his debts in odd favors, and that he kept company with a traveling undertaker who vanished the same year the spur opened. Ellery's letters to his editor grew increasingly anxious. "Something in this soil resists forgetting," he wrote. "They warn me not to dig, literally nor figuratively, but I have seen the stones of that well. They are newer than the house that once stood above them." He filed one draft article before returning east. It never reached print. Months later, in September 1897, a box containing his papers was sent back to the dispatch office with a note reading simply, "Found among his things. No one could confess where or how Ellery died." A few lines from his final draft survive, quoted in a later regional journal. "The Kansas frontier held more than guns and cattle. It held the graves of commerce itself, men who traded life for profit and buried their bargains where even God's rain could not wash them clean." By the turn of the century, the Silver Spur's exact site was already uncertain. The prairie had long since shifted, erasing the last timbers. Yet, in oral tradition, it remained a mark of caution, a place the old-timers warned their children to ride wide around. The Kansas Historical Society later referenced the Silver Spur Well briefly in a 1903 paper discussing unregistered burials across the frontier. The author, Professor Alden Price, drew a connection to the chaotic era chronicled in Dodge City's early records. The lawless overlap between trade and violence, where human remains were often simply part of the ledger. In one surviving footnote, Price speculated that the Spur's well may have served both as disposal pit and concealment, possibly for medical or anatomical material, consistent with reports near Topeka during the 1880s. That line reignited interest among university researchers decades later. But in 1897, it was just another mystery swept under the Kansas wind. The first years of the new century brought a curious calm to the plains, though the region still carried the quiet restlessness of unburied history. In 1901, a traveling photographer named Julian Meeker, documenting abandoned settlements for a newspaper series titled Echoes of the Frontier, took several glass plate photographs near what locals identified as the old spur site. The negatives, when developed, showed little more than grass and a faint depression in the soil, until one was examined under magnification. In the lower corner of the frame, faint but unmistakable, appeared a ring of stone, circular, half-submerged, and darkened at the center. Meeker annotated the image, "Former well, possibly Granger's." The note was later filed with the Kansas Historical Society, but was misattributed for decades to another location. That same year, the county received a complaint from a ranch family named Donnelly, who had settled near the site. They claimed their cattle refused to drink from a nearby pond, which they said smelled of sulfur and rust. Their letter to the Agricultural Board also mentioned a low tone in the earth, most audible on still nights. An inspector dismissed it as ground resonance caused by old limestone chambers, perhaps remnants of collapsed cellars. Meanwhile, local folklore took on new life. The story of the Well of the Dead passed from homesteads to schoolhouses, changing with every retelling. Some said the well was bottomless, others that it had been filled not with dirt, but with concrete hauled by rail before the line was abandoned. A traveling preacher claimed that the site had been cursed by the blood of commerce, borrowing Reverend Cutter's own phrasing decades after his death. One of the few factual documents from this period was a 1904 article in the Dodge City Journal referencing the legend of a vanished saloon east of the crossing. The reporter, a young woman named Helen Rollins, visited the area herself and described it in detail. Nothing remains but a circular scar in the land, and a silence deeper than mere absence. The prairie hums with wind, yet near that place it falls mute, as if sound itself were swallowed. Rollins interviewed an aging rancher who claimed to have known Sheriff Lang in his later years. He said the former lawman once returned to Kansas briefly before his death, traveling quietly to the spur grounds. He stood there for hours, the rancher recalled, and when he came back through town, he told me he'd heard running water where none should be. The article was small, buried near the classifieds, but it marked the last known mention of the Silver Spur before the First World War. Yet among those who passed through the plains at night, the freight haulers, the cattle drivers, the railmen, the name endured like a warning scratched into a post: "Don't camp by the old well." And still, as dusk fell over that lonely stretch of Kansas earth, those who dared to linger swore they could hear, beneath the hum of wind and grass, the faint and patient sound of dripping. By 1906, the Kansas Historical Society undertook a statewide survey of abandoned properties with known fatalities. One of the assigned researchers, archivist Harold Ingram, came across the Whitcomb and Lang documents bundled within a stack of unrelated tax ledgers. He was struck by the formal language of the sheriff's notes, sober, restrained, yet strangely evasive when describing the contents of the well. Ingram's field report, dated March 2, 1906, recorded: visited site formerly attributed to the Silver Spur. Coordinates uncertain. Soil subsidence visible within 30 yards of mapped position. Odor faintly metallic. No structural remains save a circle of sunken stonework. He noted that attempts to dig were thwarted by water seepage within 2 feet. Soil composition suggests secondary filling, not natural collapse, he concluded. When Ingram returned to Topeka to file his findings, he cross-referenced the name Silas Granger and uncovered an obscure business registration in the state archives. It listed Granger as co-owner of Granger Car, Wholesale Spirits and Provisions, dated 1875. That Carr could only have been J.T. Carr, the last known landlord of the saloon. The two men, it seemed, had not been strangers at all. This revelation reframed the entire legend. The Silver Spur might not have been a mere saloon, but a front for their earlier enterprise, a distribution point for contraband medical goods, and perhaps for whatever darker dealings left their mark beneath the floor. Ingram attempted to trace descendants, but every lead ended abruptly. Relatives moved away, names changed, some vanished from census records entirely. Later that year, he published a discreet internal memorandum connecting the case to reports of illegal medical cadaver trade that had surfaced in the 1870s. Universities and private collectors paid handsomely for preserved bodies, partics, usually those unclaimed from jails and frontier hospitals. Such commerce, though never publicly acknowledged, left its stain on many towns between Dodge City and Topeka. Ingram's supervisor urged discretion. "Let the legend stay buried," he wrote in the margin, "for the good of the county's reputation." The memorandum was filed away, stamped confidential, and forgotten until rediscovered decades later. Around the same time, local farmers continued to report tremors near the site, soft, rhythmic vibrations underfoot, often mistaken for passing trains that never came. One rancher swore he heard a hollow thud while plowing, as if striking wood beneath the dirt. When he dug a little, he found fragments of rotted boards, nails black with rust, and a strip of oilcloth. He burned it on the spot, fearing contamination. By autumn, drought and dust had once again swallowed the evidence. Only Ingram's brief notes preserved the faint outline of what once stood there, a well too deliberate to be natural and too silent to be at peace. He closed his report with a single, understated line. In Kansas, silence is not always the absence of sound, but the presence of something that refuses to speak. In 1908, Harold Ingram quietly retired from the Historical Society. His colleagues said he had grown withdrawn, more a ghost among stacks of papers than a man of record. But his departure didn't end the story. A new curator, Miss Eleanor Grieve, inherited his office and found the locked drawer he had left behind. Inside were two items: a folded railway map annotated with red pencil lines and a single photograph mounted on thick cardstock. The photograph, though faint and cracked with age, showed a group of men standing before a dark building with a hanging sign, the Silver Spur. The image had the unmistakable look of a late 1870s daguerreotype. On the back, Ingram had written, "Recovered from Meeker Collection, glass plate number 19. Beneath that, a cryptic note. Left edge, second figure from right. Car?" Eleanor Grieve submitted the photograph to a regional history exhibit in Topeka, unaware of its deeper implications. Visitors remarked that the image gave them a peculiar sense of unease, as if the faces were aware of being found. One attendee, a descendant of early settlers, claimed he recognized the building, not in memory, but in nightmares passed down through his family. Meanwhile, a graduate student from the University of Kansas, conducting his thesis on abandoned frontier settlements, requested access to the old Granger files. His name was Walter Fry. In one of his letters to Grieve, he described his fascination with the case. "It's as if every document attempts to forget the same set of facts. What was that well? A burial or a cellar for something worse?" Fry visited the site that summer, guided only by Ingram's map and local directions. His field notes mention a depression shaped like a circle of memory. Beneath the grass, he uncovered part of a brick foundation and what appeared to be a stone lip, weathered but unmistakably deliberate. He recorded a detail that echoed Ingram's earlier findings. The stones were newer than the surrounding soil. He took several soil samples and returned to Lawrence. Within a week, Fry fell ill with a fever and disorientation. His roommate later testified that Fry woke one night claiming to hear dripping water and a voice repeating names. He died 3 days later of unknown causes. The university physician attributed it to infection, though no wound or contagion was found. Fry's papers vanished after his death. Only a brief note remained in his handwriting, recovered from a drawer. Carr's ledger incomplete, pages removed. Whitcomb's name appears twice. Miss Grieve, shaken by the coincidence, withdrew the Silver Spur photograph from exhibition and filed it under special access required. Her curator's log closed with one final line. "No one should look too long into the faces of that picture. They seem to look back." By then, Kansas had entered a new century's rhythm, railways humming, cities expanding, But deep beneath that progress lay a patch of ground that resisted every attempt at renewal. The year 1910 brought new interest in Kansas's forgotten frontier sites. A civic group from Topeka, the Pioneer Preservation League, planned a traveling exhibit titled 50 Years of the Plains. Among the items proposed was the now infamous Silver Spur photograph, still under Miss Eleanor Greaves' care. She resisted at first, claiming the image was damaged, but the League insisted. Eventually, she relented on one condition. It would remain covered until its unveiling at the Dodge City Courthouse. On the night before the exhibit opened, a janitor named Samuel Keene reported hearing voices in the hall where the photograph had been stored. It sounded like men talking low, then water dripping somewhere, he told the local marshal. No source was ever found. The next morning, when the exhibit was arranged for public display, several attendees remarked that the Silver Spur photograph appeared clearer than before, as if cleaned or newly developed. But one unsettling detail drew attention. A faint, dark shape, now visible in one corner of the frame, a circular shadow beneath the saloon floor, resembling the mouth of a well. Some dismissed it as an artifact of light exposure. Others stepped back, uneasy. A week later, the courthouse suffered a minor fire that consumed only the West Archive room, precisely where the photograph had been hung. No other exhibits were damaged. Miss Greaves, who had been in attendance that day, left the League shortly thereafter and returned to Topeka in silence. In her final letter to the Archive Board, she wrote, "The image seems to renew itself, as though the memory resists erasure." Meanwhile, in the archives of the Kansas Pacific Railway, a new clerk cataloging freight ledgers discovered something unusual. A manifest, dated 1873, listing a shipment of wet goods and biological specimens from a sender named S. Granger Comping to an unnamed recipe east of Topeka. The manifest was marked "Never Received." The notation beside it read, "Reported missing near Spur Station." That same year, an article in the Dodge City Journal briefly mentioned rumors that Sheriff Lang's old case files had survived in private hands. The anonymous writer claimed a descendant of one of Lang's deputies possessed pages referencing a secondary chamber beneath the well. No verification ever surfaced. By late 1910, most residents had forgotten the Silver Spur altogether. Yet travelers along the old trail still told of a place where compasses spun, horses balked, and wells refused to hold water. A rancher named Cole Drayton swore his men unearthed bricks while digging fence posts, and that the air beneath was cool as a cellar. They covered it again before sundown. In time, even the location of Granger's Crossing faded from memory. Maps marked nothing there but a stretch of grazing land and the endless patient wind. Still, on quiet nights, when storms passed low and slow across the plains, old-timers said the wind took on another sound, a steady rhythm, faint but certain. It was the sound, they said, of something still being drawn up from deep below. By 1912, few in Kansas still spoke the name Silver Spur aloud. Yet within the historical journals of Topeka, the legend persisted as a footnote, buried between agricultural reports and census data. The only person who seemed unable to let it rest was a retired law clerk named Henry Talbot, who had once handled property filings for the very region where the saloon stood. Talbot, methodical and skeptical by nature, began a private review of the county's land transactions. What he uncovered startled him. A recurring sale and resale of the same small tract, approximately 4 acres, every few years between 1870 and 1890. Each transfer involved a new name: Carter, Granger, Carr, and finally a dummy company, Midwestern Distilling Concern. The last recorded deed, issued in 1888, listed no physical description of improvements. Only the phrase, "structure collapsed, sub-foundation remains intact." Talbot, writing in his notebooks, speculated that the repeated ownership changes were deliberate, intended to conceal a fixed operation, possibly smuggling or unlicensed experimentation. He found an 1876 tax exemption request under storage of anatomical materials for medical education, signed with an indecipherable hand. He sent copies of his findings to the Kansas Historical Society, noting that each signature varies slightly, as if the same man signed under different guises. One of Talbot's letters references an earlier investigator, Harold Ingram, whom he admired but considered too cautious. "The old archivist saw the edge of the truth," Talbot wrote. "He stopped where decency demanded. I will not." In late autumn, Talbot visited the supposed site of the spur himself. His journal describes his arrival. "I found no marker, no foundation, only a ring of wild grass that refused to bend with the wind. The soil was dark, though no recent rain had fallen. I pressed my ear to the jibdishadoti round and thought I heard water or a breath." A week later, Talbot mailed a small package to his niece in Emporia, containing a brass button, a shard of cloudy glass, and a folded note. The note read simply, "Proof enough. Keep this safe." The package arrived unopened. Talbot was found dead at his desk 2 days later, apparently of heart failure. The coroner's report mentioned that his fingernails were darkened as though stained with soil. Among his effects, police found an unposted envelope addressed to Miss Eleanor Grieve, Topeka Archive. "You were right. The photograph is not the beginning. It is the remainder. The well is older than the spur, and it was never meant for water." The story of Henry Talbot never reached the papers. His death was treated as the sad end of an old man obsessed with rumors. But archivists whispered of his discovery for years. Some swore that his niece's descendants later donated a button to the Historical Society collection, its brass surface corroded to a reddish hue, as though exposed to blood. From that time on, local children were warned not to dig too deep when setting posts or planting trees. "You'll find the spur," the elders would say, half in jest, "and the spur will find you back." In 1914, the Kansas Historical Society quietly commissioned an internal review of all surviving materials related to Granger's Crossing, Whitcomb, and the Silver Spur Saloon. The file was coded KHS Archive number 5117. The committee's official aim was simple: to resolve inconsistencies in prior records. But those who took part later described an atmosphere closer to superstition than scholarship. Among the review team was a young historian named Dr. Emmett Crow, freshly returned from archival work in St. Louis. Crow approached the file with academic rigor, dismissing what he called the Gothic folklore that clouds rural memory. He began by examining the photograph retrieved from the Meeker collection, the same image that had disturbed Miss Eleanor Grieve years earlier. Crow noted its composition, age, and exposure time, concluding that it was genuine to the period. But in his personal notebook, an unsubmitted draft contained a single sentence crossed out so heavily it nearly tore the page. The reflection in the window shows 6 men, though only 5 stand before it. From there, Crow retraced the paper trail, Lang's notes, Whitcomb's sketches, Talbot's letters. He even consulted the Dodge City Journal archives, where he found a peculiar clipping from 1888 reporting on 2 bodies sent east for study. The article was unsigned, but the phrasing matched Sheriff Lang's handwriting. He began to suspect that the so-called medical freight operation under Granger's name had indeed involved human remains, but perhaps not in the way he first thought. One afternoon, while reviewing estate ledgers in Topeka, Crow located a surviving bill of sale dated March 1877, transferring a shipment labeled Preserved Subjects 3 from Kansas Pacific Spur. The recipient, Topeka Medical College Anatomy Department. What made the document chilling was the sender's notation, Initas, als SG, followed by a brief phrase in faint ink. Water took the 4th. Crow later wrote in his field journal, "If true, the well itself may have been the 4th. Not a tomb, but a reservoir for those unfit for study." He traveled to the site in the autumn of 1914. The prairie was yellow with drought, wind scraping the horizon clean. His assistant later testified that Crow stood at the supposed location for nearly an hour, saying nothing, before kneeling to touch the ground. When asked what he heard, he replied, "It isn't sound, it's waiting." Crow returned to Topeka, intending to publish a small paper titled The Spur Anomaly. It was never completed. He fell ill within a week. fever, disorientation, and night terrors described by witnesses as suffocating water dreams. In his final entry, written in a shaky hand, he noted, "There is no bottom. The well continues downward through time itself." Dr. Crow died that winter. His notes were locked away at the Historical Society, filed with the others under restricted access. By then, a pattern had emerged. Each investigator who sought the truth of the well seemed to follow the same path. First curiosity, then revelation, then silence. And Kansas, steady and wind-worn, carried on as if nothing had ever stirred beneath its fields. By 1916, the Silver Spur case had become what historians call a quiet file, a sealed matter referenced only in whispers among archivists and county officials. Yet one more attempt to document it emerged, this time from an unlikely source. A schoolteacher named Mrs. Ruth Elwood, who ran a small one-room schoolhouse near what had once been Granger's Crossing. Mrs. Elwood was known locally for her habit of collecting frontier stories as moral lessons for her students. That spring, she recorded a series of oral accounts from aging settlers, noting how their tales seemed to converge on a single memory, the well. Her handwritten manuscript, later titled Voices from the Prairie, was discovered decades afterward in a library storage box. She described the ruins of the Silver Spur as a place the earth itself has forgotten how to cover. One elderly farmer, James Holcomb, told her he had seen faint light from beneath the soil like a lantern trapped under glass. Another, Mrs. Mabel Cutter, grandniece of the old Reverend, recalled family warnings never to speak the name Granger after sundown. "My grandfather said the ground there still breathes," she told the teacher. Mrs. Elwood, skeptical but intrigued, visited the location one afternoon in May. Her entry that evening is simple. "I found the stones. They form a circle smaller than I imagined. The soil around them is cold, though the sun burns. Something below shifts when the wind passes. I cannot tell if it is water or memory." She brought back a small piece of stone, pale gray and polished smooth by time, and placed it on her desk as a curiosity. Over the following week, she began to complain of sleeplessness, saying she could hear dripping inside the walls of her schoolhouse. Her students noticed she sometimes paused mid-sentence, staring at nothing. Her final entry, undated, reads only, "It calls by name, though I never gave mine." Neighbors found her schoolroom empty a few days later, the stone still resting on her desk. Her horse was tethered outside, untouched, and her papers neatly stacked. She was never located. When county authorities cleared the building, one official noted that a portion of the floorboards near the teacher's desk had darkened, warped upward as though from moisture beneath. The condition was attributed to humidity and dismissed. Mrs. Elwood's manuscript was later filed under Folklore, Western Kansas, rather than evidence. But a marginal note written by the cataloger survives. Interviewed locals all describe same sound beneath the ground. None approach site after dusk. By that time, the region had changed. Telephone lines were rising. Automobiles rattled across the plains. But in that quiet patch of earth, no one built, no one fenced, and no one lingered. Even without maps or markers, travelers somehow knew when they were near it. The air would cool, and the wind would falter as though pausing to listen. By 1918, the Great War had taken most of Kansas's attention eastward. Young men marched off, telegrams arrived bearing sorrow, and whatever haunted the ground at Granger's Crossing fell again into silence. But silence in Kansas, as Harold Ingram once wrote, was rarely empty. In the autumn of that year, while influenza swept through Dodge City, a field hospital was hastily erected near the old Spur Road. Among the soldiers and nurses stationed there was one Dr. Lydia Hanrahan, a physician trained in Topeka. In her personal notes, later donated to the Medical College archives, she mentioned hearing local farmers warn her not to draw well water from the hollow east of the road. She dismissed it as superstition until the night one of her orderlies brought in a bucket from that very spring. The water, she wrote, carried a faint metallic hue, like rusted coins dissolved. That same week, 3 men fell sick, their symptoms unlike influenza: no fever, no contagion, only weakness and disorientation. They described dreams of falling through black water, Hanrahan recorded. The illness passed as quickly as it came, and the source was never officially traced, but she noted a curious echo of an older tale. Among the nurses was a woman from Emporia who had heard of the Silver Spur from her grandmother, Henry Talbot's niece. When Hanrahan told her where the camp stood, the woman turned pale and said, "Then we've pitched over the well." The hospital closed by winter, and the site was abandoned once more. Yet after the war, a brief geological survey by the Kansas State College listed the area as unstable ground. The report noted that subsurface cavities of unknown origin persist at a depth of 12 to 15 feet. It concluded that these hollows might be remnants of collapsed limestone cisterns or human-dug shafts. The phrase human-dug was later underlined in red pencil by an anonymous reviewer. That same year, the Historical Society quietly moved the Silver Spur records from Topeka to storage in Lawrence. Several files, including Whitcomb's original notes and the car ledger, went missing in transit. The inventory sheet simply read, "One crate, unaccounted for." When the new archivist cataloged what remained, she found a peculiar annotation at the bottom of Crow's old field journal. The handwriting was unfamiliar. "If the dead sleep in water, let the living beware of thirst." From then on, the story of the well became a ghost spoken only in hints, an unmarked danger on the map of Kansas memory. By 1920, few people remembered the name Silver Spur. The land had changed hands again, sold cheap to a widower who raised cattle and swore he'd heard nothing strange. But in one of his letters, sent to a friend in Topeka, he admitted that sometimes his livestock refused to graze near the center of the pasture. "They look that way," he wrote, "as if someone's standing there already." The 1920s brought new prosperity to Kansas, roads, radios, and a slow forgetting of what had come before. The last surviving link to the Silver Spur was fading into rumor and wind. But in 1923, a young surveyor named Paul Denning, working for the state's new Highway Commission, accidentally redrew the legend back into existence. Denning's team was tasked with mapping drainage patterns for a proposed road between Dodge City and Greensburg. In the course of this work, they drilled a test bore near an area locals called the Hollow Field. The auger struck stone at only 7 feet, unusual for that depth, and when withdrawn, it brought up not shale or clay, but fragments of polished limestone arranged in a curve. Denning described it in his field journal. The shape suggests a man-made structure. Under the midday sun, the stone feels cold. Thinking they had located the foundation of an early homestead, Denning widened the borehole slightly. Within minutes, groundwater began to rise, clear at first, then dark, almost black, with a faint odor of metal. It overflowed onto the soil and pooled at his boots. "The ground breathed," he wrote later, "as though the hole exhaled." That evening, while lodging in Dodge City, Denning shared the discovery with an elderly hotel clerk who asked where he had been working. When Denning named the section, the man grew pale and whispered, "You dug the spur." He refused to elaborate. Denning returned the next morning with his crew, but the borehole had drained completely. The soil was dry, the air unusually still. They abandoned the site and recorded it as inconclusive. Weeks later, Denning's supervisor in Topeka received a sealed envelope containing a photograph, the same Silver Spur image known from the Meeker collection, scrawled on the back in fresh ink, "Found it again." The postmark was from Dodge City, but Denning had vanished before it arrived. Newspapers carried brief notices of his disappearance. Surveyor missing on Kansas plains, horse found grazing near test site. The story never reached beyond the county. His field notes were recovered from his quarters, though several pages had been torn away. The last legible line read, "The stones move when you listen." In later years, geologists passing through the region remarked on the strange soil composition, dark, fine, almost metallic, and the persistent humidity that lingered at its center. No official records connected it to Denning's work. By then, the state highway rerouted 3 miles south, avoiding the hollow field entirely. Local laborers said the ground there wasn't right for building, and so the spur, whatever it had once been, remained buried, its outline erased, but its presence still felt. Even as Kansas grew and modernized, a quiet warning persisted among the road crews and ranchers: never dig where the grass grows cold. By 1926, memory of the Silver Spur belonged more to whispers than to written record. The war had remade the state, and most of those who had once known the story were gone. Yet something lingered. When drought struck that summer, the beginning of what would later be called the Dust Bowl, strange patterns appeared in the parched earth near the old spur line, rings of darker soil that refused to dry even under weeks of relentless sun. A photographer from Wichita, sent to document the damage for a newspaper feature, captured one of those rings in a panoramic shot. At first, the editors thought it was a lens flaw, but when they compared it with older maps, the coordinates matched precisely where the Silver Spur was believed to have stood. The photo never ran. According to archive notes, it was withdrawn for technical correction and later misplaced. That same year, the county hired a driller named Bernard Tate to open a new irrigation well near the same area. Tate, a practical man, had no interest in legends. But after several failed attempts to reach clean water, he noticed his borehole struck something solid. He wrote in his log, "Stone, circular, white as bone, not native to this soil, broke through, water rose foul." He abandoned the attempt and sealed the hole, noting that the water smelled of rust and medicine. Within a week, his crew complained of headaches and insomnia. Tate himself fell ill, muttering of voices under pressure. His wife later burned his workbooks after he died in his sleep that November. The event never made it to the newspapers, but within a few years, local farmers avoided the area altogether. They said the wind there blew differently, slower, heavier, as if dragging through water. Around that time, a young researcher named Alice Venn, studying frontier urban legends for her dissertation at the University of Kansas, came across the lead file labeled KHS Archive number 5117. In it, she found notes from Harold Ingram, Emmett Crow, and even Henry Talbot. The patterns were undeniable. Every investigator ended the same way: fever, disorientation, disappearance, or death. Venn summarized her findings in a private letter. The spur does not behave like a place, but like a thought. It reappears each time it is remembered. She never submitted her paper. Her advisor later told colleagues she had taken ill and withdrawn from the program. Her room was found empty, except for a single page torn from her notebook reading, "The well has no water, only reflection." By the decade's end, the Depression swept across the plains, erasing farms and families alike. Dust buried what grass remained. The hollow field became just another nameless patch of earth on government relief maps. But some travelers, those passing west by wagon or truck, swore they still saw a shimmer at dusk, a ripple on land that should have been dry. They said it looked like water struggling to return to the surface. By 1931, the wind itself had turned against Kansas. Dust rose from the dry ground and hung in the air for weeks, turning day into dull twilight. Farms died, rivers shrank to threads, and the land forgot color. In that slow-motion ruin, the story of the Silver Spur flickered one last time, like the final breath of a buried flame. That spring, a federal survey crew arrived from Washington to photograph the region's worst-hit areas. Among them was a geologist named Franklin Moore, tasked with measuring soil collapse. He kept a careful field diary, full of technical language and dry statistics, until one entry deviated sharply. Northeast of Dodge, Section 12, unmarked ground. Subsurface instability detected. Hollow echo, depth unknown. Crew reported hearing movement beneath when pressure applied. Later that day, Moore's assistant described how their instruments, normally steady, began to hum faintly when set over the site. The readings registered an intermittent vibration, rhythmic and faintly fluid. Thinking they had struck an underground aquifer, Moore ordered a small test dig. The soil, he noted, was unnaturally moist, almost oily, despite weeks of drought. Within an hour, The pit began to seep dark water that shimmered in the sun and carried the unmistakable odor of iron. The dig was halted. A memo was filed stating probable chemical contamination from early industrial waste, and the team moved on. But in a private letter to his wife, Moore wrote something different. "I heard it tonight, just after dusk, a steady dripping, far below the surface, where no water remains." He sealed the letter with his field tag, KHS Archive, number 5117. Weeks later, when the survey's results were published, that section was omitted entirely. Officially, the land was recorded as barren, unfit for agriculture or development. Within a year, it was abandoned again to the wind. Time, as it always does, folded the story under. By the 1940s, even the maps that once hinted at the Silver Spur had been redrawn, its coordinates erased by new boundary lines. Yet the few who still remembered, the archivists, the railroad men, the old ranchers, spoke softly when they passed near that stretch of earth. They said the dust seemed to settle more slowly there, as if reluctant to touch what lay beneath. And in every retelling, one detail remained unchanged: the faint, steady rhythm that could sometimes be heard on windless nights when the plains fell utterly still. A sound too regular to be imagination, too measured to be chance, like water dripping patiently through stone, marking the passage of years. Some called it the land breathing, others said it was memory itself. But those who had read the old records, the names of Whitcomb, Granger, Carr, Lang, and all the rest, knew better. They said it was the well, still waiting beneath Kansas, still not empty.